So here, I haven't got a piece of rigid film insulation, neither have I got, planks that I could stack on the floor to make diagonal cuts through the hardwood, plywood and board sheet. So I would be improvising using this rack here. You really don't need to do this, as you could employ the use of a table saw and a ripping fence, to make diagonal cuts, but I haven't got access to that at the moment. And, making diagonal cuts can be quite tricky. Okay, so I would be using this rack in place of my workbench or my table saw. Do not try this if you do not know what you're doing, okay? But resort to using your workbench or your table saw to cut diagonal cuts from your hardwood plywood. But I'd use this, because I'm quite confident, that I'll be able to pull through. It's freezing and cold outside, so I couldn't stack up planks, to place the board sheet on top to provide clearance for the circular saw's blade. Don't have access to a table saw at the property, and even if I decided to use a traditional workbench, I may be able to strip off wood on, on the side of the workbench, but not to cut diagonal cuts, from the hardwood plywoods. And that's where, this rack comes in handy for myself, okay? The two circular poles or bars at the very top of the rack would be where the hardwood plywood board rests. The two circular bars or poles are quite ductile and malleable, so I would be clamping on the board, using my two G clamps to secure the board onto them two circular bars or poles at the very top of the rack. So the poles are quite rigid, they are firm, and sort of like just gives just about the right tension that you need to secure the board onto them poles. Suffice to say, it's not just like a rounded grip with them G clamps, at the poles. It's sort of like, a flattened out, grip, slightly flattened out grip, with them G clamps, when securing the board onto them poles, okay? A slightly flattened out grip just about where the fixed jaw and the movable jaw, intersects with the board and the pole, okay? As previously highlighted, the vacuum adapter goes to one end of the coupling and the hose goes into the other end. Adjust, the mechanical fastener appropriately, until you get, a tight fit, on the vacuum adapter. Once the hose and the vacuum adapter have been adequately secured onto the coupling, then you install the vacuum adapter with two screws onto the circular saw, just like I've done here, onto the fixed guard. So we have fastened the vacuum adapter onto the dust extraction outlet, onto the latches, onto the fixed guard with two screws. And prior to this, connected directly a suitable vacuum hose to the adapter. And so basically, we have set the depth of cut in line with the thickness of the hardwood plywood that we want to cut. If you don't know the thickness of the material that you want to cut, just set, the blade beside the thickness of the material directly, just underneath the base plate, and then subsequently adjust the depth of cut scale accordingly. And once you have set the depth of cut, just slightly beneath the thickness of the material, push the lever down to lock the depth of cut into position. Before you proceed with this operation, make sure that you're wearing the appropriate safety glasses, an approved face mask and ear protection. For health and safety reasons, you don't want damage to your hearing, you don't want respiratory issues or, getting carcinogens into your respiratory tract. So protect your eyes from foreign object debris. Health and safety is very important. The next step of the process would be to carry out a risk assessment with regards to slip and trips, where you've got, one side of your vacuum connected and, the other side where you've got, the circular saw connected. Make sure that you've got enough clearance when you're moving. And you can also see that the vacuum hose is on the right. So halfway through the cut, I'd have to adjust so that the vacuum hose doesn't get in the way. And here you can see the working tool or the circular saw's connection point. to prevent the movement of the rack when cutting and to allow, for clearance when I'm done with the cut, so that the circular sawer can exit the end of the cut easily. I have wedged the rack with a chair against the door. You can wedge it with an object of your choice that provides, impediment or, movement of the rack when cutting. You don't have to do this, we're just improvising here, okay? Make sure that the good side of your plywood is facing downwards, as the circular sawer cuts in the upward stroke. And so it is more likely that you'd get the rougher bits on the underside or the bottom side as opposed to the top side. The next step of the process would be to cut in line with the markings on the underside. Set the base plate of the working tool on the underside of the plywood, right at the lines of the markings. Get the saw blade spinning right before it engages the plywood whilst the base plate, is sat flush on the underside of the plywood. Do not start the working tool right where the saw blade engages the wood. Always hold your saw firmly with both hands when operating. You need steady hands when trying to cut through the hardwood plywood. Your switch is locked off to prevent accidental starting. Your working tool has got a safety on and off switch. Firstly, depress the lock off button and then subsequently depress the on and off switch. After depressing the on and off switch, release your hands from the lock off button. The switch is now on from here onwards. To switch off, just release your hands from the on and off switch. The blade may continue to rotate after switching up, so just wait until the tool comes to a complete stop before setting down the work tool. Ensure that the saw blade is not in the way of the cord or wire and that you're slightly offset, from the working tool when cutting through the plywood. The most probable root cause of why the saw blade has stalled or binded is because it has deviated from its line of cut or wavered during the cutting process. Suffice to say, cutting at an angle. Or it could be that, the work tool was leaning on either side of the cut work pieces, where we were trying to make diagonal cuts, thereby cutting binding. If this happens, do not pull the work tool, from the wood piece. As earlier highlighted, just release your hands from the on and off switch. Like I said, the blade may continue to rotate after switching off. Just pretty much wait until the tool comes to a complete halt or stop before setting down, okay? After which, you can reposition, the working tool, along its line of travel or linear travel, okay, ensuring that the blade doesn't rest on the wood and it's free spinning, whilst you're trying to retrace its line of travel. You can start at, at the very initial position where you started making your diagonal cuts, or you can start off, at the position where the saw blade stalled. But if you're experiencing difficulties, from the stalled position, you can start from the initial position and retrace your line of travel, all the way through whilst making your diagonal cuts. So I will replicate the process, of cutting through your plywood when you're halfway through. So here you can see that, I'm providing enough room for the saw blade to spin, prior to cutting, halfway through the plywood. At this stage, I have ascertained that the blade isn't angled and, it's free spinning. So I'll proceed, to finish off, the cut, as I am pretty confident that the saw blade would not be latching or cutting into the sandwiched sides of the hardwood plywood. Just make sure there's enough room and it's not picking on the sides of the plywood before you proceed to finish off, your cut through the cut line. this is the first cut, and it's not an entirely smooth, fine quality cut, but at least we know what our do and don'ts are. And please do note that other less probable kickback causes could result from overheating, which causes the blade to warp, blade dullness and unguided cuts, sap build up in the blade, and lastly, incorrect blade height. So let's visually inspect, the diagonal cuts to see if we've got, fine quality cuts. And straight off, you can see that, it's not a very fine or pristine quality cut. And, there are a host of reasons why this has happened. Firstly, you can see that, the blade bent at an angle. We kind of wiggled and, we didn't accurately have a continuous cut. It wasn't a linear cut. And as such, the blade binded in the sandwiched edges of the plywood. Secondly, the blade selection isn't spot on. Okay, we have selected a ripping blade here, which is more suited for ripping applications as opposed to applications for veneers like your plywood. A combination or general purpose blade would have been more suited for your hardwood plywood, as cutting or making diagonal cuts on the plywood involves ripping and cross-cutting at the same time as you cut through its line of travel. Click on the link in the description or at an earlier part in the video where I kind of discussed, blade selection with respect to your hook angle, your bevel, the number of teeth, the tooth configuration, and what blade is suited for what material. Okay. The next step of the process would be to repeat and reproduce the process, replicate the process, not that we know exactly what we're doing, to get, finer quality cuts from the ripping blade. A workman is only as good as his tools, but we're just going to try and get, good quality cuts from the ripping blade. But, if we wanted optimal quality cuts, then, your combination blade or your general purpose blade, is the way to go, as they are capable of producing the finer quality cuts that you see on the side of the hardwood plywood. So we are going to make more diagonal cuts, but ensuring that, our hands are sturdy, we're not deviating from the cut line or the line of cuts, we're not wiggling, we're not, putting pressure, of the work tool onto the material that's being supported by the poles of the rack, whilst ensuring that our saw blade spins freely before it engages the hardwood plywood, and if possible, engineer a continuous cut. So the next step of the process would be to replicate and run the saw blade through each subsequent work piece line of travel. And as you can see, this is a much better cut. So we're going to replicate the process again and cut this hardwood plywood into 4 pieces diagonally, from both ends. Reclamp subsequently and replicate the process on the half cut plywood hardboard. And like I said previously, make good use of your safety lock-off button, okay, to prevent accidental starting. And when ready, press on the switch or the trigger. Make sure that, the saw blade has enough room before it starts, cutting through the wood. and cut linearly continuously along its line of travel, or along the pencil mark that you've lined up on the hardwood plywood. The next step would be to rework the plywood hardwood piece where we had the binding or the kickback from the work tool. Just strip off the side to get a finer quality cut with the circular saw. And trust me, this stripped off bit is not the best looking piece on camera, but it looks a lot better, in person when you actually visually inspect, the stripped off piece. And as you can see, it's not the best looking quality cut, aesthetically, but it's better off than the binded cut that we had previously. At best, the blade has just done is slightly below par of medium cross-cutting and ripping, of the hardwood plywood. A combination or general purpose blade would have done a much better job with respect to getting quality cuts. Once done, place the working tool on its underside. Despite the fact that we've got a lower blade guard to protect the blade, you don't always want to be placing a working tool where you've got the blade, because that could damage the blade accidentally. Okay, click on the link in the description for useful links on how to set up your circular saw working tool and how to select your blade when cutting certain materials. And that's about it really. If you found the information in this video useful, don't forget to subscribe, like and share. Helps the channel grow, and hopefully catch up with you later. Goodbye.